video is learning targets 13 and 14 and the ecology units concerning succession and then human interference. So first we'll look at this concept of succession. And ecological succession is just the change in types of species in a community over time. We would expect this to happen in ecosystems. Ecosystems exhibit change over time as new species move into them. Typically, we represent this with the types of plants that move into the ecosystem. Plants change the landscape, they change the rock, the soil, they create new habitats for animals. And so we're going to look at two different kinds of succession. And the first kind is called primary succession. And with primary succession, I'll write that up here, primary succession. This is when an ecosystem starts at rock, typically from the formation of new land, like with a volcano, for instance, the formation of an island or like a volcanic eruption. This is where we begin with a blank slate. And the reason I put a new frontier is to help us remember that the first species that move into this area are called pioneer species. They're the very first species to move into an ecosystem. These are species that can live on rocks, that don't need roots. They can just live right there on the rocks. There are two types of species that can do this. They're called lichens, L-I-C-H-E-N, looks like lichens, but it's pronounced lichens, and mosses. And these two types of organisms come in, they live on the rocks, and they break down the rocks into soil over time. There's some moss, kind of looks disgusting, but if this moss living on the rock is going to break this rock down over time into soil. And what would you expect to happen as soil begins to move into the area? Well, you're going to have some of these other kinds of plants that move in. So as soil is formed, grasses and shrubs begin to grow. And those grasses and shrubs are going to further break down the land, and they're going to create more habitats for animals. And as they die, they're going to decompose. They're going to turn to soil as well, creating deeper and deeper levels of soil over time. And then eventually you're going to have the first trees move in. These first trees are going to be evergreen trees. Why evergreen trees? Why pine trees? Because they have very shallow root bases. They grow very quickly, and they reproduce fairly quickly. And so these big trees are going to move into the ecosystem. They're going to create new habitats. They're going to break down the soil even more. And then you're going to have hardwood trees. These are things like oaks and hickories, and they're going to move into the community very last. They have very deep roots. They require long growing times. And this is what's called a climax community. The climax community is the highest level community can move into an area. Again, this is typically hardwood trees. And in any given ecosystem, you're going to have sections of the ecosystem that are at the rock stage. You're going to have several sections that are at the grass and shrubs. You're going to have evergreen sections, and you're going to have hardwood sections. And so a climax community isn't necessarily all hardwood trees necessarily, but it represents the highest level that an ecosystem can go to. So this here redwood forest, for instance, it's not going to get any better. There's not going to be bigger trees that are going to move into the area than a redwood forest. LBL in some parts where there's all hardwoods would represent a climax community. It's not going to change after that. Now, you can have an ecosystem change. Say, for instance, something like fire, something comes in and changes it. This is where secondary succession comes in. This is when a community starts over, but at the soil level. Usually after a disaster, like a fire or a flood. Could have to do with farming as well. And again, succession never stops in an ecosystem. Even the climax community is going to die off at some point. And so you're always going to have this succession going on. And so secondary succession in some ways is always happening. But again, to separate it from primary succession is where you start at rocks. Secondary succession is where you start at soil. And so switching gears completely here, we're going to look at humans and their effect on the environment. Humans have grown exponentially for 1,000 years or so, and they began to damage the biosphere. And so a couple of different things that we can look at that are both good and bad, I guess, kind of lumping them all together. Recycling, this is a good thing. This is just taking materials and repurposing them for the same use or for a different use. Um, there's a nice little joke for us there, but recycling is more of a normal part of our way of life now than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. It's just we take these materials, we reuse them, we repurpose them, and instead of making new things. And that brings us to renewable resources. Renewable resources are resources that continually renew themselves. They don't deplete. Essentially, as long as the sun exists, these energy sources aren't going to deplete. Wind power, hydropower, as long as there's water, we'll always have hydropower. Solar power, again, if the sun turns off, we'll have bigger problems than lack of energy at that point. Geothermal power, that comes from the heat in the earth. The earth cools down, we have bigger problems than a lack of energy. And so there are several types of renewable resources. Thinking about like plants, trees are a renewable resource to a degree. It takes 50 years to grow a hardwood forest, but it is a renewable resources in some respect. Then there's pollution. Well, pollution is just the introduction of materials into a natural environment that can cause harm. It's more of a technical definition. We all understand what pollution is. This individual is chosen to swim in this polluted water for some reason. Don't know why. But pollution it's a pretty big part of our world. Um, we see it all over the side of the road. In some cities, the air is really thick with smog, and in the ocean, there's just giant flotillas of trash moving around together because of pollution. Pollution is a very important or very destructive part of what we have done to the biosphere, and so we can all do our part to eliminate pollution to some degree. Habitat reduction. This is the destruction of ecosystems, and they cause animals to lose their habitat, thus causing them to die, move away. And when animals move away or when they die off, this creates imbalances in the ecosystem, and this is not good. And so you can see from the picture here, why is habitat reduction happening? Because there's highways, because there's cities. There are ecosystems that are now at a fraction of what they were 200 years ago when America started colonizing this country. There are certain ecosystems that exist at like 1% of what they used to be. And so with that goes lots of species that we'll never have back again because of habitat reduction. And that leads then to a loss of biodiversity. Well, what is this a picture of? This is a picture of some Asian carp flopping around. Well, what does Asian carp have to do with anything? They're an invasive species. We brought them here accidentally. They've come into our waterways, and they are much better at than our native species at eating the things that they eat. And so they are driving down populations of our native species as they increase. And so this is causing imbalances. Again, there's the picture of the food web. As you begin to destroy pieces of that food web, as you lose biodiversity, you break down entire ecosystems. Concept of endangered species. Some species have become threatened by human involvement for poaching. Tigers are a great example of this. They take their fur. Elephants, walruses for their tusks. Whales for lots of different whale stuff. They get destroyed. And so this has caused many species to be endangered, many species to be critically endangered. This is a picture of a Siberian tiger. There may be 300 or 400 of these left in the wild. It's not a good thing. And so we have done our part to make sure they are endangered for sure. Another type of problem with biodiversity is this idea of non-native species. There are some species that are introduced into an ecosystem. These species didn't evolve here, and so they create imbalances to trophic levels. This picture here is a picture of a toad. You can kind of see it. It's wrapped up in the snake. But in Australia, they introduced a toad called the cane toad, this really big frog, to get rid of a certain other parasite. Well, the toad ended up taking over. And the problem with this toad is none of the native species can eat it because it's poisonous and it kills everything that it comes in contact with. Anything that tries to eat it, it kills, and so it is actually doing more damage to the ecosystem than good. And so you would call this an invasive species, something that is invaded, and in this case, that humans introduced in order to control the ecosystem, but has ended up doing more damage to it. A loss of genetic diversity is another problem. This is a loss of different types of genes in a population. This can cause extinction if the species is unable to adapt to an environment. It's a great example of this is the Tasmanian tiger. That's what you see there. I know it doesn't look like a tiger, but that's what it was called when it was still around. But it's a perfect example of the loss of genetic diversity and how it was unable to adapt to changing environments due to human encroachment in their environment, and they went extinct somewhere around the beginning of the 20th century, or around the first part of the 20th century. Another example of genetic diversity is in potatoes. In Ireland, they started just growing one type of potato, and well, that led to this great potato famine because there was no genetic diversity among the potato crop. All of the potatoes were affected by this blight, and it killed all the potatoes, thus nearly destroying the country of Ireland because of this famine that happened in the early 20th century. And so Ireland, because they tried to grow just one type of potato, actually suffered from not having genetic diversity among the type of potatoes that they grew. And global warming, this is now probably a climate change is a better term for this, but we still kind of talk about it as global warming. And this is the concept that the increase or the temperature is increasing. Um, the average temperatures in the biosphere have gone up, and there is debate on how much human involvement and human interaction has caused this to occur. Is it a part of the Earth's normal cycles? Is it a part of humans doing and creating a problem for the biosphere? Yes, it's probably the answer. It's probably a normal part of our Earth cycles. However, human involvement in the and destruction of and what all we've talked about basically has caused these temperatures to be exacerbated and creating more and more of an issue. And climate change is a better term than global warming because it's causing the extremes in our temperatures and the extremes in our climates to be worse than they normally would. Storms are stronger than they normally were, floods are bigger, and so climate change has caused the extremes to be more extreme than they normally would because of the interactions that humans have had with the environment. And then lastly, human consumption. This is just our own consumption of the ecosystem and the resources in this ecosystem. Here's a picture of deforestation. We consume resources much faster than they're able to replenish. And if you do that, you'll find yourself with nothing. And so humans in in order to keep these resources restored, must slow down their consumption of the resources. And so part of doing that is, for deforestation, for instance, would be replanting. And there are other ways of renewing resources as we attempt to create a better system for our environment.